Welcome to the second Farmers Weekly Transition Summit. My name is Andrew Meredith. I'm the editor of Farmers Weekly, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. In this 5-part summit series, we are taking a closer look at all the issues related to preparing to adapt your farm business to survive and thrive as farm subsidies change and new environmental schemes are introduced. This is just one part of our transition project, which also includes coverage in print, on our website, and a special podcast series. In each strand of transition, we aim to bring together farmers from around the country and representatives from all parts of the agriculture industry to help everyone prepare for some of the biggest changes we have seen in decades. In just 14 days, farmers in England will feel the effect in their pockets for the first time of the government's change in policy. Their BPS payment will be smaller than last year. In the rest of the UK, things are happening at a slower pace in that respect, but everywhere the emphasis seems to be on using farmland to deliver environmental goods and services as well as produce food. There is also a commercial pressure from some consumers to demonstrate the environmental credentials of our food and drink, which is incentivizing firms to require more from their farmers, including reducing emissions. Tonight, I am joined by 2 panels of experts to take a close look at the journey to net zero for agriculture. In the first session, we will be taking stock of the situation and asking how you can get started with assessing your own carbon footprint on your farm and why that may or may not be necessary. In our second session, we'll be taking a closer look at what opportunities there may be to find a financial benefit from storing carbon and reducing emissions, and who will be best placed to do that. But before we get started, let's first of all hear a bit more on the topic from our transition editor, Johan Tasker, and then watch a second video straight after that from our transition partner, Marks and Spencer.
Welcome to the second Farmers Weekly Transition Agriculture Summit. I'm Transition Editor Johan Tasker. Climate change is our biggest challenge as a planet, as a country, and as UK agriculture. For many people outside farming, the focus is often on reducing emissions, especially from livestock.
Those of us in agriculture, though, know that it's much more complicated than that. Unlike many other industries, when it comes to climate change, UK agriculture has the potential to be part of the solution. The NFU has ambitious plans for farming to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, a full decade before the government's own 2050 net zero target. In this Farmers Weekly Transition Summit, we will look at how that goal can be realised and what it means for you.
Where to start, what tools to use, who has most to gain, and how maximising the opportunities from carbon can help to secure a more sustainable future for your farm business.
As a business that's been around for 137 years, we know how important it is to look to the future. M&S has been built on a belief that caring about our impact on tomorrow's world, as well as today's, is not just good citizenship, it's good business. And that's why in 2007 we launched our sustainability programme as Plan A. Fast forward 14 years, and this is now a climate emergency. Carbon dioxide concentration is the highest in at least 2 million years, and the world now sees twice as many days over 50 degrees centigrade each year as it did in the 1980s. We cannot shy away from the challenge of climate change. It affects us all, our colleagues, our customers, the people that make our products across our supply chain, and the many global communities we serve. Whilst the challenge may be daunting, we know that change is possible. Our heritage has shown us time and time again that when we come together as an M&S family, we can change things for the better. In 2008, we were the first retailer to banish the free carrier bag. It was 2012 when we became the first major retailer in the UK and Ireland to achieve carbon neutral status. But we know we need to do more, and that's why we're putting a sustainable future at the heart of our strategy. Our Head of Sustainability, Carmel McQuaid, is going to explain just what that means.
Our Plan A programme affects every area of M&S. Here's what that involves and what we're determined to achieve.
At M&S, we know there's no Plan B when it comes to our planet. That's why we're focusing Plan A on our mission to become a net zero business by 2040. Put simply, net zero means we don't add any more greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere than we take out of it. To do this, we need to know our carbon footprint, which at M&S is around 5.7 million tonnes each year. This is made up of the emissions from running our shops as well as our distribution and transport network. However, this is not just about our own operations. The biggest impact comes from what is called Scope 3 emissions. These include how suppliers source, make and move our products, and how our customers use them. So from mills to our tills, from farms to forks, we will have to transform the way we do things. Our first goal is to rapidly reduce our carbon impact, cutting our footprint by a third by 2025 and more than half by 2030. To get there, we'll need to act quickly, cutting our emissions in property and transport, reducing single-use plastic, closing the loop on recycling, and minimising food waste. We also want to make sustainability easier and more rewarding for our customers. We will be investing in new products and services to help them enjoy a lower carbon lifestyle. As an own brand retailer, we're uniquely positioned to work with our trusted suppliers and partners. Together, we are committing to zero deforestation, sourcing more sustainable fibres, driving the circular economy, and supporting farmers as they move towards regenerative agriculture. We know we can't do this alone, so we're working with others to make this a reality and together achieve net zero by 2040. Because there is no Plan B.
British agriculture is tremendously important to our business and to our brand. We have been long supporters of UK farming and we enjoy some of the best supply chains anywhere in the world. Our Select Farm programme has been industry leading for a number of years. We've worked with our Select Farms to ensure that we've developed leading animal welfare standards. Now it's time that that programme evolves. We're recognising the challenges that climate change is bringing and we're adapting that programme to ensure that we're capturing information that we're phrasing as farming with nature. This Farming with Nature programme will evolve. It's a partnership between Marks & Spencer's and the farms that supply us. We recognise the huge amounts of good work that are already going on UK farms. Our Farming with Nature activity will concentrate on carbon, on water, on biodiversity and on soil health. And it will ensure that we can not only establish where our farms sit today, but help us prioritise activity and investment in these areas for the future.
Working with M&S is an exciting challenge. They are always asking us how we can do things better, how we can improve, and making special product lines with M&S has been really rewarding. And then of course there's the things that you don't see on the shelf of Marks & Spencer's. The way that we're encouraged to look after the environment, to look after the soil. They really care for the environment.
Fantastic. My thanks to M&S for that video and to Johan for his contribution before. But let me first of all now welcome this evening's first panel to get straight into some of these issues that have been raised in those videos in more detail. Alongside me are Simon Jeffrey, a soil microbial ecologist from Harper Adams University. Then we have Matt Ward, Services Manager with agronomy firm Hutchinson's. And completing panel one's brain trust, we have the AHDB's Head of Environment, John Foote. Thank you all for joining us this evening. John, let me start with you, if I may. Johan said in that video that climate change is UK agriculture's biggest challenge. I sense some of our listeners this evening may have bristled at that comment with everything else that is going on. Is he right? And if so, why do you think that is?
I think he's partly right, but actually I think he was a bit pessimistic. Because actually I think with all challenges, there are also opportunities. And there will be opportunities in the future in terms of, farmers and growers being able to be paid for sequestering carbon, for putting nature-based solutions in place, and providing other environmental services, as was touched on. But I do think there are a number of challenges, and they're quite unique to agriculture in that, measuring the performance is not easy to do. If you're running a power station, you can put a big gas meter at the front of the power station and measure the amount of fuel you burn and work out the carbon. We're dealing with biological systems that are complicated and interact with each other, and so that direct measurement is not possible. So we have to rely on tools and models to help us do that. So that means that changes that farmers may be delivering don't necessarily feed through as quickly in terms of those models and tools, and it makes the productivity gains look less exciting than maybe in other sectors. So I think as farmers and growers, we need to focus on what we can measure, and often those are the things that drive better economic performance. And, it's worth remembering that carbon is money at the end of the day. And we've seen that recently with the massive spike in terms of fertilizer prices, because the price of natural gas has gone through the roof. And that's fed through to that product which is, uses the natural gas to produce it. So if we can then optimize the use of, those controllable costs like fuel, feed and fertilizer, then we're likely to also see at the same time reductions in the carbon footprint, improvements in productivity, improvements in terms of sustainable farm incomes, and actually that's got to be good. And I suppose the last thing I'll say on this topic as well is that we mustn't forget that climate change will bite farming. We've seen it in floods some years ago, where fields flooded around Cockermouth, and the farmers up there were left with fields strewn in stones that then meant that there was a long period of time to take to recover that land for use for even livestock farming. But other farmers will find that they've got too much rain at the wrong time of the year and too little when they need it. And we may have to adapt the sort of crops that we grow to deal with these sort of challenges for the industry. We've also got to be aware that emissions are very much something that we're being beaten up about, especially on the livestock side. And we need to be quite robust and bold about countering some of those claims, because we're often compared to global averages, and UK agriculture is often far better than those, often by 50% lower in terms of reductions.
Well, let's go straight to Simon on one of the earlier points you made about the extent to which farming has a problem. Simon, you spend a lot of time measuring farming's impact above and below the ground. Where does UK farming sit? And if we are one of the best, does that mean we don't really need to do a lot, or do we still have a big problem?
Well, it is a great question. I mean, John is completely right. In most sectors, we perform quite well compared to the global average, but we still have quite a long way to go to net zero. Now, one of the different things about agriculture compared to many other sectors is that there is carbon sequestration potential within agriculture, and many industrial businesses don't have that potential. So that is something that sets agriculture apart. However, that said, a lot of the carbon sequestration potential of agriculture can be frequently overstated. There are a number of pools of carbon, such as soil organic matter, which have been depleted due to the way we've been managing soils. And certainly there is potential to store more carbon in our soils and store more carbon above ground in hedgerows and in woodlands. But over time, these pools can saturate. You can't just keep feeding carbon into soils. At some point, they will basically have as much carbon as they can hold, and any more carbon additions will get burnt off as carbon dioxide. So it's very important not to lose sight of the fact that we do need emission reduction as well as this carbon sequestration. Because if we go put all of our eggs in the carbon sequestration bucket, we may find ourselves in a situation 20 or 30 years down the line where all of our sequestration pools are full, we're still emitting loads, and we have no way of tying up those emissions anymore.
So a twin track path. Matt, in your work at Hutchinson's, you're obviously speaking to a lot of farmers on a weekly basis about these very issues. Are you encountering a lot of cynicism out there? And what's your pitch to farmers sort of about why they should be getting involved now and starting this journey to net zero rather than focusing on day-to-day problems instead, shall we say?
Yeah, I think the other two speakers have alluded to some of that already, is that managing carbon is good for business, that soil health is good for business. It also happens to sequester carbon. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that it should be considered, managing carbon should be considered just a productivity measure. And I think John mentioned that, none more so now with the price of fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer in particular, where it is, then that would be the focus that we would be concentrating on, is that I agree entirely with mentions before about we can't just rely upon it being sequestration. It has to be both emission reduction as well as sequestration, and we can't overstate the importance of one or the other. It has to be both.
Let's get straight on to our first question then from an audience member. Thanks to Andrew Vosey for kicking us off this evening. He says, how do we help farmers and the wider industry understand the difference between carbon credits for offsetting that do tie your hands when the supply chain expects you to be net zero? So between that and carbon certificates, which are bought by the supply chain precisely to evidence progress on their supply chain commitments. So essentially, should we be prioritizing, or what's the difference between offsetting for other industries and offsetting for our own industry, I think is what Andrew's asking. Who wants to come in on that first?
I'm happy to come in on that. I think we as an industry probably want to make sure that we can provide offsets for ourselves, and then look at the opportunities from other sectors who will also be looking to offset. At the moment, the market lacks maturity here in the UK, and there are only a few schemes that enable assured measurement of those offsets, and that's the Peatland Code and the Woodland Code. There will be others with time. And I would say at the moment, the prices that are being offered, and from what I've heard, talking to farmers, are far too low. So again, I would hold fast and wait for the cost of those, or the price that you get, to come through, along with some of the legal protections which have been talked about in the Environment Bill around putting covenants for natural capital and carbon into deeds for land, and making sure that there is some sort of payment, not just a one-off hit of money to plants and trees, but to maintain that offset or project that you've put in place. And I think without that, I would sit and wait and see how the market develops, and maybe use them for yourself, because they may have far more value to you in terms of how you can talk to the supply chain above you.
But we obviously know, as I alluded to in my opening remarks, that sort of BPS is going to decline in the short term. There's a pretty strong incentive, isn't there, for some farmers in particular, perhaps if there is money on the table, let's say from an airline, why shouldn't they pick it up now? Simon, have you seen many of these schemes so far? Heard much chatter about them?
So I haven't seen many of the schemes come into practice yet, but there is certainly quite a lot of chatter about them. One of the issues with the approach that's being suggested is how it can penalise some farmers compared to others. So if you're a farmer who for a long time has been looking after your soil very carefully, using very good quality organic amendments, cover cropping, you've been looking after your hedgerows, maybe planting trees on marginal lands, it could well be that you're quite near the maximum sustainable potential of carbon sequestration on your farm already. There might not be more space for you to be able to plug into this market to be able to access some of that funding that's going to be available. So I think whenever these systems are going to be implemented, and there's a number of different approaches that are on the table at the moment, it needs to be careful to be done in a very equitable way, so that people who have been managing their systems very well from the start aren't penalised in favour of those who have basically been beating their soils, ripping out all their hedgerows. They have a lot of potential to store a lot more carbon on their farms.
So you're saying, in effect, that if I've got a lot of carbon in my land now, it's going to be harder to get paid for what is sat there than if I can demonstrate that I'm increasing that amount? Or have I misunderstood you?
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. With the way that people are talking about implementing carbon markets, unfortunately, that is the way that it's heading at the moment. Now, there are other approaches out there where people should where people can just get paid for continuing with good practice. So, for example, paying people to use cover crops, reduced or no-till, and paying people to use these effects on the basis that they're storing that carbon in their soil. Because if they weren't doing these things, if you go from a minimum disturbance soil management system to a full inversion tillage, you will end up burning off some carbon and putting it back into the environment. So farmers could perhaps be paid to not do that, as well as being paid to store carbon in the first place.
And Matt, quite a lot of interest, obviously, around changing tillage for a number of years now. But so perhaps that isn't one that we can really say early adopter anymore. And some folk obviously say it's just going back to how it was years ago. Anyway, is there still an appetite from more and more farmers to perhaps put away the plough, or is everyone that was going to do it or could do it easily, have they done it already effectively?
There is more interest. I think, going back to the previous point, if I may, I think that's where baseline measurement comes in. That knowing where you start, so don't use that as an excuse. Well, I might not be paid for something which, if I'm going to improve now, so I won't start until I know that I'm going to get paid for it. I think that's I wouldn't want anyone to have that impression. I don't think any of us believe that. But I think that the adoption of zero-till is gaining lots of credence, but we've seen that it's not a panacea. It has to be in conjunction with all sorts of management activities in order to be able to earn that right, to be able to do zero tillage. And just having the right drill does not give you the right to be able to do zero tillage without having other management issues. You might solve one problem, only creating another.
That sounds like farming to me. Let's go to our next question then. Jane submitted this one before the summit got started. So thank you to Jane. I hope you're joining us this evening. She asks what sounds like a simple question, but could be quite complicated. She'd like to know who owns the carbon in farmed tenanted land. Is it the landlord or the tenant? And therefore, I guess, who's going to benefit from it? Anyone know if there is an answer to that, or is that one still to be decided?
Yeah, Matt.
Depends. Sorry, I will be a bit flippant about this, if so, forgive me, but it'll depend what your tenancy says. And if it doesn't say anything about it, then it will depend on the negotiation you have between landlord and tenant, and so it's ever been.
John, do you want to come in there?
I was going to say exactly the same. And I would imagine actually many tenancies are actually lack any information on this at the moment. They probably predate this whole concept. So I think, there is a point at which you're going to have that conversation with your landlord, if you're a tenanted farmer, to understand who does accrue that benefit. I think it's also important, if you are leasing land, and maybe you're under a sustainable farming incentive scheme, and maybe you've got some carbon elements in there, or maybe you want to know what that carbon's worth when you rent the land out. Again, going back to what Matt was saying, you need to measure that carbon. You need to have that baseline, so that if you've leased that land and it comes back in a worse state, maybe there's a penalty, or you don't damage what you've signed up to do as part of SFI, because you've leased the land maybe to grow for somebody else to grow potatoes. So these things now need to increasingly be thought about when those sort of deals are done, where historically they've not been so much of an issue.
So I'm sure there's some tenants out there now sort of sat thinking, well, landowners, they can already do more diversifications than me because my landlord won't let me convert that barn into a shop. And now I'm sat here thinking that landowners down the road are going to be able to do so many more schemes related to carbon, while mine's going to be traded away. And maybe even if they're, let's say, a dairy farmer who has been asked to go to net zero, they may not be able to even prove that. Do you think, is there a real reckoning going to be between some landlords and tenants over this? A bit of a battle?
Potentially, but again, I think it's understanding where you're starting from and what the value is, and having that conversation. But I would imagine for most of the tenancies that are out there at the moment, there is nothing in that tenancy about carbon, and or even, in some cases, how the new SFI will be sort of managed. So it may be that, it's worth getting some paid advice and some support, one, to help you establish that baseline in terms of your carbon, to think about what your options are on the farm, and, then understand, who could potentially take those benefits, or even maybe, you get to a point where there's the ability to co-share those benefits in a fair and equitable way.
Okay, let's ask another quick fire question. We've got one from Paul here. He's asking, will farmers already in mid-tier stewardship be able to enter the sustainable farming incentive? Is there any barrier for those people already in an environmental scheme joining the next one? What do we know about that at this stage? Who's been following up on that? Matt, you can go for that one if you like.
Yes, so we have clients that are in the pilot scheme in the beginning at the moment, but also the DEFRA have announced that you would be able to enter into the soils standard next year, even if you are already in a mid-tier agreement. So you couldn't have entered into the pilot scheme, but you can enter next year if you've got a mid-tier, but only into the soil standard. That's the only standard that's going to be, actually that's not true, but that is the one that you'll be able to enter into next year. So you won't be disadvantaged.
Okay, good. Well, I think we settled that one. Let's move straight on. Simon, I'm going to come to you next. We've talked about this or that amount of carbon briefly already in your farm or in your land, but maybe we need to take a step back. We haven't even covered how to measure it. And Ben is asking, is there a system for recording soil organic matter / carbon content over time to prove carbon capture and therefore have a saleable commodity? Is there a system out there that's, it has trust throughout the supply chain, I suppose, is another way of putting that, isn't it?
Well, I can't talk about the supply chain in general, but there are certainly methods out there that you can quantify soil organic carbon. Basically involves collecting samples, processing them to remove any of the obvious bits of plant litter, and then analysing them in the lab with a bit of equipment. It's relatively straightforward. Where the issue arises is that the amount of soil organic matter as dispersed across a field is highly variable. So depending on the point that you choose within a field, you may find a quarter to 0.5% more or less soil organic matter in one sample compared to if you're sampled 10 meters to the left or 10 meters to the right. And that makes sampling validation over time quite problematic. So I have a PhD student who was doing this for a field experiment who wanted to see how carbon was going to be going for the 4 years of her project. And for that, she sampled 100 different points over 1 hectare, which obviously isn't manageable for farmers. This is where one of the difficulties comes with benchmarking. You could benchmark your soils, for example. Next year you come back having done best practice to build up your soil carbon, and just because you happen to have chosen an area which is slightly sandier, for example, you will find less soil organic matter there, even though if you'd looked in the same place as you had gone before, it might have technically gone up. This is going to be one of the hard things that's going to be to deal with moving forwards. As a general rule, in order to pick out differences with soil organic matter, you can normally see differences over about a 5 to 10 year period. If you just introduce some cover crops into your field and measure it before and after, you won't really see much of a difference. So these are all things that the regulators are going to have to bear in mind when it comes to benchmarking and then monitoring soil changes as carbon changes over time.
And do you know how much sort of work is being done on developing a standard that perhaps will be used across all the different sort of tools that are in the marketplace now, rather than each having their own, as is the case at the moment?
Well, for measuring soil carbon, there are fairly standard and well-used techniques that we've been doing in science for about 100 years. Sometimes they're incorrectly applied. There's a very famous pedotransfer function to get from soil organic matter to soil organic carbon, which has been known to be wrong for about the last 10 years, but some national laboratories still use that number. So there is more research that's needed and more outreach and education that's needed. But the tools are there, they're well established, there's nothing terribly complicated, and many labs have the equipment that can do it.
Does anyone else want to come in on that one? Is there anything further to add there? Go for it, Jonathan.
I think Matt was just ahead of me, so.
Oh, beg your pardon. Let's go for it, Matt.
Well, I was going to say that Hutchinson's have a service where we do exactly that, map soil carbon variation across the field, just as a slight plug, but promise that'll be the last one.
But, yeah, go for it. Go ahead, Jonathan.
I was going to say there is also in the pipeline development of various ISO standards, so that these are internationally recognized standards. And I think those will become quite important. So they'll build upon the work that Simon was, discussing, but actually standardize it across the world. And that becomes important when we want to maybe trade carbon with international partners, or make sure that when somebody's declaring that their product is net zero in Brazil, for example, that they're measuring it and doing so on a basis that is equivalent to what we're doing here. And they haven't got some sort of favorable sort of calculation that makes them look better than they should do. So we need those international standards, and they're coming, but we'll start to see those coming in the next 2 to 3 years, and that will underpin a lot of the way in which we record carbon, report it, talk about it, and are able to trade it. So unfortunately, they're not there yet, but certainly I think we'll see a step change.
So it's not so much measuring it in the soil that is the issue, but it's then plugging that figure along with all the other figures and arriving at a carbon amount per hectare or per ton of output that is the real issue at the moment then.
It is, but also, there are ways in which we have to do the accounting for carbon at a UK level, at a farm level, and at a product level, and those approaches are very different. And so, to determine the full life cycle of a particular product is much more complicated and detailed than, maybe reporting carbon at a UK level, where you can make some broad assumptions, model it, and come up with an answer. So as you go down the scale and you get towards the farm, it gets harder to do, unfortunately. That's not to say it's not impossible, but, we have got carbon tools that are out there. And, I would recommend that farmers use any of the tools that are out there, one that is suggested by, their supply chain partner, one they're comfortable with using, but stick to using that same tool year in, year out, because if you chop and change, the answers will get different. You need to realize that as you measure carbon, your footprint will get worse. You'll find it buried under the bed, in the kitchen cupboards, wherever you happen to, and that's just a fact that you're measuring it better. The other thing is that the way that these tools work will change, and some of the tools have got some major updates coming through in the next few years in terms of the way that they deal with carbon sequestration or emissions from soils, and that will make things look worse. But actually, it's just on paper. And to deal with that, you just put your old data in and rerun the sort of tool and run it with that new module in and get a comparable answer. So all of these things have got to be done, but it's important that you build up that baseline, come up with a plan, and then use that plan to inform the choices and investments you want to make on farm. At the same time, AHDB is working very much in the background to develop, sort of standardization across those tools so that we can give farmers and growers confidence, but also the supply chain confidence that what's coming through those tools is more accurate. And that will take another couple of years to work through. Again, it's complicated and we can't just impose a single solution.
A question now from Charles, and thank you, Jonathan, for that. He asked, do you agree that transition means reduced inputs on farms? What is the view of the panel upon how this will impact the support trade to agriculture? So it's a couple of our biggest, carbon costs on farm and fertilizer and fuel, I believe. So if farmers are farmers likely to be limiting those in the near future in a way they haven't been up until now, perhaps. Matt, do you want to share your view on that first?
Yes, I think surely the measure has got to be as a productivity measure per ton of output rather than on a per hectare basis, because otherwise we're just exporting the problem to someone else. So I think we have to take responsibility, but I think that's where we can make big inroads, in that we can identify using technologies that are available, field variation, and we can identify the emissions variation across that part of the field as well. And so we can make good use of that information to then start using more appropriate inputs where more appropriate inputs are the right thing to do. Or in some cases, it may be that we can't do that, and the better thing to do is to take that part of land out of production and put it into some stewardship agreement that will then sequester carbon. So it won't be just about reduction in inputs. That'll be part of the story, not the only story.
Simon, do you want to just pick up on that point? Taking land out of production, is that, you've been studying a lot of farms. Is there a lot of land essentially that in some parts of the UK, at least, that is uneconomical or will become so?
Well, certainly with the way nitrogen fertilizer prices are going at the moment, it's feasible that could be the case. In terms of soil carbon sequestration, one of the best things you can do to store more carbon in your soils is take it out of arable production and put it into grassland. Now, in terms of reduced inputs on farms, I suspect it's a case of having different inputs on farms as much as reducing them. For example, coming back to nitrogen fertilizer prices, obviously many farmers are trying to make the nitrogen fertilizer go further and use it more efficiently these days. So combining that with advanced fertilizers, with ureas and nitrification inhibitors, has been shown to increase nitrogen use efficiency and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions such as nitrous oxide from soils. So in some studies that I've seen, you can reduce the carbon footprint associated with your fertilizer use by as much as 90% by using these inhibitors. So I think it's a case of engaging with technology, reducing emissions that we know, reducing inputs that we know are necessarily bad, and changing to ones that have a smaller carbon footprint. And sometimes there will be trade-offs there. A classic one is digestate. There's more digestate produced in this country now, considerably so than there was 10 years ago. Some farmers like it, some farmers hate it, but undoubtedly it can provide nutrition to your crops. It has nutrients in it. But when you apply it to your field, if you apply it when it's a bit wet, it give off a little bit more methane, which is a greenhouse gas. So it's all about finding this balance. The pathway to net zero certainly isn't going to be an easy one. We are in the process of the transition here at Harper Adams. Our farm is on the pathway to net zero. And so hopefully we're going to have research that we can feed into the wider farming community to help people on that journey.
John, less inputs. Are there still farmers out there who are perhaps using a bit more than they could be, and they could find a better margin if they used less? Is that likely to be a common way to reduce emissions at the same time?
Undoubtedly, there'll be a few that have maybe putting on, should we say, a little bit extra just for insurance. But I think increasingly with stricter regulation and the sort of high cost of some of these inputs, and the need to demonstrate that you are putting on the right amount of material, that actually most farmers are very careful and sort of moving in the right direction. But I do think, it's about, looking at what are you putting on and what are you getting out in terms of crop and optimizing it. And I think the word optimize is the word, and it may not necessarily mean that you reduce that, but you can demonstrate that you're getting the best bang for your buck, both economically and in terms of the sort of climate benefits. I do think there will be opportunities to look at alternatives, and there may be co-products or byproducts from other industries that provide some benefits to agriculture that we historically haven't used, that if they're safe and deliver valuable nutrition, that can be used. We may see increasing amounts of livestock going back into some of the arable areas as part of that rotation, with grass lays and the manures being used to enhance the nutrient availability. And on the livestock side, I'm sure we're going to have to use technology to deal with some of the methane emissions from when cows basically burp, and therefore how can we use that to get the biggest hit, along with things like genetics and traditional sort of breeding techniques to sort of get the most efficient animals or plants that can deal with the challenges of climate change or the market.
Just following on from that, we got a question from Tom. You mentioned manures there, and he's saying, should livestock and arable farmers work together more to share fertilizer in the form of manure? Are we going to see more straw for muck swaps? I guess the price of those are changing a bit at the moment. Is the value of manure going up as the value of fertilizer goes up? And what's that doing to those relationships?
I think inevitably we will see more of that. But the fundamental problem with most of the manure and slurry, and I'm going to generalize here, say most of the manure and slurry is on the west coast of the UK, and where it's needed is on the east coast, and it's too wet and heavy to move across. So until we can find technologies that help us dewater, that slurry and muck in a way that makes it easy to transport and economic to transport, it's not going to be very attractive for the time being.
Perhaps one of our biggest mistakes then in farming history was specialising too much then. There was a time when we were mixed farming across the UK, but it seems a pretty tall order to think that there'll ever be a time when we perhaps go all the way back to that. But maybe a few more mixed farms in the future than there are now then. Let's turn to other land uses. We haven't really mentioned planting trees too much. And I know we had a question from that here. Let's find it. Yes, a question from Gillian. Perhaps you want to come in on this, Simon. She's asking, what is the general thinking at the moment about planting trees? She's saying deciduous trees only sequester carbon when in full leaf compared with winter wheat, which is green over the winter period. So I suppose the broader question there is, are trees a bit overvalued at the moment, and perhaps grassland and cropping undervalued from a sequestering point of view?
It's kind of a fair point to an extent. The thing is, a tree will keep sequestering carbon year on year, whereas with wheat, basically the carbon that's tied up within that wheat will get burnt back into the environment when an animal or a human has eaten it, and they respire out carbon dioxide. So the carbon balance isn't quite the same. In order to make trees really effective for sequestering carbon, it is important to use the wood that's produced for a purpose, turning it into furniture, for example, because that means you can grow another tree and that carbon will stay sequestered in that furniture for, 100 years, maybe, if it's a good bit of furniture. Where the issue arises, if you just plant a load of trees to offset some carbon, they will sequester carbon as they mature, and they will sequester it at quite a high rate. But as they get mature, that carbon sequestration rate will decrease to the point where eventually it will end up in an equilibrium, and the leaves decomposing will basically be similar to the carbon that's sequestered when the leaves come out in green again. So trees are sometimes overstated. They're not an infinite storage of carbon. We need to be careful about that. If you're using the wood for a purpose other than burning it, then the carbon sequestration potentially increases a little bit. But certainly you can store more carbon in trees than you can in a crop, because there it's cycled every year, basically.
And we've got some enormous tree planting targets, haven't we, at a political level? Matt, are you seeing farmers eyeing up some corners of some fields to plant a few trees? Is there enough appetite out there to ever meet these targets, or are they a bit pie in the sky, do you think?
Well, I think the challenge is the impact that they have on other aspects of the management. And I think it's much more realistic that they're to be able to do more with grass. And in the short term, as I understand it, then actually you can get some much better sequestration from grass than trees, which need managing. That you then have a problem of the impact they have on drainage systems, the impact they have on shading and pests and all the other things that are not as straightforward. And then with plantation systems that we've had in the past, it's not the planting of the trees that's the problem. It's the managing them as they mature. And so that, are you just kicking the can down the road?
And John, I'm sure you were closely following events at COP26. A lot of chat about trees there, but is it too much about trees and not enough about grassland at the moment? Is that your view as well?
I think we need to sort of balance the the equation and talk about the importance of grasslands, because actually the wrong trees in the wrong place can be, just as damaging, and you can end up with massive increases in carbon. And we've seen that where, you've had plantations put onto peats, for example, and it's caused immense damage as the peat dries out, and you end up releasing more carbon than that woodland would ever store. So I think it's about, the trees in the right place, and also thinking about whether or not it's land sparing or land sharing. And at the moment, most of the government's talk has been about land sparing, but actually there are some very good examples where potentially you could put some trees, maybe some willow, for example. I've seen it done on regenerative farming systems and organic systems, where they've planted willow. It grows quite quickly. It's put in places where the cattle, for example, wait to go in to be milked. The cows eat the willow, they self-medicate, but it also provides, shelter from the wind and rain, somewhere to get out of the sun. And I think, more trees in the sort of landscape planted at the right density would still enable you to get machinery and livestock, but increase the carbon stock on that land without having to go to a fully wooded scenario. So I think the debate needs to be more nuanced rather than this black and white, it's grass, it's wood, it's none of the above, and I think that's where we need to get to.
Okay. Question now from Martin Wilkinson at Harper Adams. So I don't know, is he teeing you up for a friendly one here, Simon, or is he posing you a very tough question? He asks, where can we find up-to-date response data for anticipated crop yield response for differing levels of fertilizer input to aid this decision making? So where's the information on the right amount of fertilizer at the different cost levels, I suppose?
Yeah, I'm going to say, I'm guessing that question wasn't directed at me because it's not really.
Maybe not. Who was to come in on that one?
Actually, RB209 does have a break-even ratio calculator within it. If you've got a FACTS qualified advisor, then all FACTS qualified advisors have had a update with beyond the pricing that has been currently available, and our own Omnia nutrient management system has a break-even ratio built within it. But RB209 does have that ability.
Yeah, and I was going to say, my team manages RB209, so we have just updated those break-even curves and issued some guidance on the HDB website. So if you go there, you can see the latest advice in terms of managing those fertilizer inputs. But again, if you don't want to use RB209 yourself, then use that FACTS qualified agronomist or farm advisor, and they can help you develop a plan for the crop and the farm systems that you've got. Okay,
here's a question from excuse me, Michael Brain. Michael, thank you for your compliments, and we're having a great session here. We've still got a bit of time. He asks, does the panel have any view on the benefit of anaerobic digestion from animal waste as a commercial opportunity as much as an environmental one, considering digestate byproducts as well as biogas output? So is that and renewables in general, I suppose, we haven't really touched on this evening, but does anyone think that we're going to see a lot more anaerobic digestion sprouting up as we try to tackle net zero?
I think we need to, really. If you have livestock, it's going to be very difficult to achieve net zero without adding as much value as you can to your waste. If you're producing slurry, it's a bit of a no-brainer to run it through an AD system and get methane from it, and then apply the digestate back to your land to offset fertilizer requirements. So the way that AD has been implemented to date, or particularly up until there was a requirement to introduce 50% waste, didn't really make a lot of sense in terms of sustainability because it was incentivizing people in the incorrect way. In terms of adding value to waste, anaerobic digestion certainly has a place moving forwards on the road to net zero.
And I agree with that. And I think, it may be that you don't have an AD plant on every farm, but, maybe collectively you come together. And I suppose that's the other thing that's worth bearing in mind, that net zero doesn't have to be achieved at every farm either, or it could be collectively with a group of farmers in an area that come together to try and achieve net zero by planting trees, putting an AD plant, having renewable, and then sharing those benefits. And that may come in, there may be opportunities with local nature recovery and, the sort of next layer into the sort of ELM scheme. And I think, we will increasingly seeing farmers and growers coming together to develop these local projects that benefit them all.
Okay. Did you have, sorry, flicking my question window around, and did you have anything to add there, Matt?
No, I agree with the others. Where you've got mixed systems, then it seems to be very sensible. I think the challenge would be in arable businesses, but in those instances, then you've got other opportunities, wind or solar.
All right, we've just got a few minutes left, so I just want to bring it right back to the beginning here, finally, and just talk a little bit then about first steps. If there's farmers who have joined the conversation knowing that they want to start tackling these issues, they don't quite know where to begin, and some of the talk this evening has inspired them, let's just talk about first steps and where to find more resources. Perhaps a tip from each of our panels. Why don't we start with you, Jonathan?
So first of all, for me, it is start measuring your carbon footprint. Don't wait to be asked to do it, because actually you may be asked to provide several years worth of data. So as I said earlier, choose a tool, any tool, use that tool consistently. Understand where you've got hotspots, and all of the tools give you an idea of which sort of areas will have the biggest impact, and it's usually around feed, fuel, and fertilizer. And then choose the ones that you think you can tackle easily to make those best bits of money that will make or save you money, and target those and have that plan and follow it through. But don't just make that plan. Tell your suppliers that you've made a plan, because they may reward you for that. Or they may, be happy to have a conversation with you, and there may be some sort of areas of support they can provide. Keep following that plan and be honest about where it doesn't go right, because none of this will work first time. And be prepared for, some significant challenges. Your footprint will get worse, but actually it will then get better. And that's just part of the natural cycle of measuring your footprint. And then, if needs be, seek professional advice, either from your vets, other trusted advisors, your agronomist, to sort of help you with that journey.
All right, Simon, do you want to follow on from there? Is there enough help out there, and what are your advice on first steps?
There is enough help out there. There is free advice available through people such as the Carbon Trust and the like. So there are places where you can go for free advice. The key thing to bear in mind is that not all carbon footprints are equal, so they won't all give you the same results. We need to be careful that people don't just try many different carbon footprints and then go with the lowest one, because as John said, they are going to change over time. Many of them don't allow you to incorporate the amount of carbon sequestered at the moment, or if they do, it's a very rough estimate. And things like soil greenhouse gas emissions are currently missing as well. So as John said, your carbon footprint is going to change over time, but it's probably a good idea to start benchmarking your site now so you can see where you are. But yeah, try and find help if you need it. There are free advice places out there. And there are carbon consultants as well if you're willing to pay.
All right. Matt, I've left you last. I've given you the hardest job, but just quickly, any final thoughts from you?
I think discuss with your agronomist what you're trying to achieve, and they will give you some insight into where they think that there is an opportunity.
Perfect. Well, that's all we have time for with our first panel. Look, it's an enormous topic, so I hope we've just whetted your appetite this evening and help you realize there are some opportunities here as well as some threats. There's still some gaps in our knowledge. Things are going to change, but it seems like the best thing is to just get stuck in and start assessing where your business is at, and then everything else will flow from there. My thanks once more to Simon, Matt and John for being so generous with their time and expertise this evening. We're going to roll straight into our second discussion in a few moments, where we focus less on the case for the net zero agenda and look more closely at some of the potential financial opportunities associated with it now and in the future. But first, it's time for our second transition partner video of the evening from forestry management experts Till Hill.
Welcome to Till Hill and Carbon Store. We're the UK's leading woodland creation and management company. Today we have Chartered Foresters Stuart Pearson and Callum Murray, who between them have over 60 years forestry experience, and David McCulloch, Head of Carbon Store, our expert in the woodland carbon offsetting market. Today we are talking about using woodland creation as a means to gaining a greater income for your farm business, whilst helping us all to meet our net zero target. Stuart, tell us, can farmers make more money by planting trees on marginal land?
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, trees can offer you a real alternative future income stream. Many farms will have land that is currently unproductive or, due to changing farming practices or incentives, is becoming uneconomic to farm. The great news is trees don't require the best land to grow and indeed can thrive on this unproductive land. Allowing them to become part of your wider farm business diversification strategy. And as a country, we need more trees, and as such, there are excellent grants available to support the planting and establishment of trees. For example, in England, the new English Woodland Creation Offer is one of the best schemes I have ever seen, covering most of the costs involved with planting trees.
Thank you, Stuart. So now we can understand a farmer can make money from planting trees, but Callum, what other benefits can woodland creation bring to a farm business?
Georgina, there's so much more you can get from woodland on farms. It's just a couple of examples. You know, a bit of strategic planting can give you shelter, help you keep your livestock out for longer. That can help you reduce your feed costs, increase growth rates, and indeed possibly help keep the vet bills down a bit as well. And beyond that, we're also starting to think about how we can actually offer more shade for livestock as we see our climate changing. Trees can also be a real boost to wildlife, and that can help the overall diversity on the farm. And in a different direction, you could potentially, by planting trees, give yourself some sporting cover. So a different route to income possibly there. What I suggest is that where you've got ground that's really only giving your stock a limited bite, then you really might be better to see if that ground could be in trees. It'll likely earn more for you, as I think Stuart said, and we know in many cases that spending less time managing poor ground can actually let you focus on producing just as much from the best of your farm.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Callum. David, can you tell us the first steps a farm business has to take if they want to generate an income from carbon credits utilising tree planting?
Yeah, sure, Georgina. So, I mean, the very first step is to get an experienced and a qualified forester out to visit your farm who can design the woodland and make sure that you're putting the right trees in the right place. And to be honest, that's Till Hill's core strength. And actually, there's no one who does that better. So once you've got the design for a woodland mapped out, we in Carbon Store will then help you every step of the way to realise the £6,000 to £7,000 per hectare that woodland carbon could be generating from your tree planting effort. So we'll help with the lengthy and the bureaucratic paperwork that's necessary to generate the carbon credits. And then we'll also help you sell the carbon credits to a buyer so you get the best possible price for them in a way that is also supported by clear and robust legal agreements. We've worked really hard to design a service that delivers an efficient and effective service with a clear and transparent fee structure that basically helps you maximize the income that you can earn from selling your woodland carbon credits.
That's great. Thank you so much, David, and thank you to all of you. Our presentation today highlights the importance of planting trees on marginal land and the benefits it can bring to a farm, both in terms of income and biodiversity. Teal Hill has planted over 1 billion trees and counting. We do this for a living and know what we are talking about. Thank you for watching.
Perfect. Well, welcome back, everyone, and thanks for making the transition across to our second panel session for this evening. I do appreciate you all joining us, and apologies for my first cheesy joke of the night there. We've done well to let it linger until now. Thank you to Teal Hill for that video on forestry's contribution. It's time now for our second panel discussion of the evening, and I'm delighted to be joined by not just 3 but 4 distinguished guests for this session. So with me are Oxbury Bank's Chief Customer Officer Tim Coates, who is also a farmer as well, Dr. Michael Marsden, an animal feed specialist with ABN and KW Alternative Feeds, as well as chair the AIC's Legal and Scientific Committee. We also have William K. Croft-Ely, who is chairman of miscanthus firm Terra Vesta. And rounding off the panel this evening, last but certainly not least, is Sophie Throop, Head of Agriculture, Fisheries and Sustainable Sourcing at Morrison's. Good evening, everyone. Tim, I'm going to come straight to you. There's obviously a lot of talk about a lot of different opportunities out there at the moment, private and public, but perhaps the biggest of all for farmers in England is the Sustainable Farming Incentive. It's the pilot now. We've had a lot of sign-ups for that, and you're one of them. Why don't you tell us a bit about your experience with that so far, good and bad?
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew, and good evening. The SFI pilot, I'll start with the bad, the ugly, as it were. I tried to tot up how long it took me to complete the application for the SFI pilot, and I gave up when it went over 100 hours worth of time. So first warning signal there. Partly that was because the parameters changed during the application period, which was not helpful. And I'm sure this is the sort of thing, hopefully they will ease out in the it is a pilot after all, and there's part of being part of the pilot is to be paid to suffer so others don't have to in the future. But unfortunately, some of the things that I'm suffering with are repeats of things that I've suffered with in the past to do with BPS or CS applications and claims, etc. Slightly unreliable systems, a distinct computer says no sort of mentality, and all the normal sort of joys of negotiating, engaging with the RPA. On the other hand, I think the scope of ambition within the SFI and the various standards within it is good. There is, I think it's really good that there are levels that you can get into in different standards, so you don't have to sort of meet too many prescriptions to start with, and you can build up the competency of what you're doing over time. So I think the flexibility within it is much more open than I've seen under previous agri-environmental schemes in which I've participated in. So that's quite a hopeful sign. And they're also talking with the pilot about the ability to adapt as you're going, which again is also quite a good thing, because previously under, say, for example, I've come out of a mid-tier CS for this, which was 5 years of being stuck with what I thought was a good thing 6 years ago. And ideas change as we're going to be discussing tonight. So that's good. There's clearly going to have to be a lot of work they're going to do if they're going to deliver this on time, I think, for 24. And I'll be happy to keep updating people what it's like to be a pilot participant.
Thanks very much, Tim. William, I know you're also a farmer as well, aren't you? Are you also in this pilot trial, or did you decide to keep your powder dry for the time being?
No, I'm not, because I've still got the carryover of a higher level scheme, which stopped me going in for it. And one of the sort of kind of little challenges that I face is that mine actually ends in February, whereas all of the new schemes run with the calendar year, which effectively is going to give me the best part of a year without any scheme at all. But I dare say there are plenty of others in that boat as well.
Thank you. There's a broader point here, isn't there? Historically, environmental schemes, the only game in town has been government provider. But now we are seeing more and more of this talk about future schemes, some of them coming from the private sector, some of them, of course, offsetting other industries. And we talked in the first session about the concerns about that, around giving away carbon that you may need for your supply chain. So that brings me nicely on to you, doesn't it, Sophie? The issue is retailers like Morrison's and many others are going to be wanting to see lower emissions in the future to be able to put those credentials on the shelf. So are farmers going to be paid for that?
So yes, so thank you very much. So we're certainly, as you say, working really hard on the whole net zero concept, and net zero very much being about that focus on lowering emissions as low as it can possibly go, and not just relying on sequestration. But for us, it's about how we can sort of support farmers to try and make the most of those opportunities on farm. We certainly, have not got the intention to try and run off with all the gain for no effort put in, if you like. It's actually just how we can understand how we can make an economically sustainable future for farming. So I think it's really interesting, actually, that we have potentially got the first time where wider society is going to consider sort of investing in the good work that farmers can do to help provide some of the climate solutions. So I think the whole sort of it's very an emerging market as you describe, and at the moment it's a little bit just tread carefully until everything gets sort of settled. However, I think it's not really a question of us just sort of insisting on one sort of element of type of supply without understanding the sort of the costs that go into sort of getting there, which is why certainly in our scheme we're doing a lot of investment and support as opposed to just setting targets.
Some of the more perhaps cynical farmers may say, you're asking us to jump through all these extra hoops, but does the consumer actually care? We hear various statistics bandied around. Aren't 91% of consumers still buying primarily on price? You must see a lot of these sort of surveys. What's the reality from Morrison's perspective? Yes,
I think we need to absolutely recognise that when we're doing all of our shopping, and we have to look at our own habits as well. We are very much as consumers motivated by location, what's near to you, what's a good sort of price, where do you want to sort of invest your hard-earned cash, and so yes, of course, those things are really, really important. However, we do know as well that customers do care about the environment, and they do care about the welfare of animals as well, and the two things mustn't be lost, really. We can't have one without the other. That holistic picture is really important for customers. So it's about understanding how we can help support farms to sort of transition over these next few years to sort of take on further work in the environment space, and to try and sort of have those products that customers want to buy. Because certainly the emerging generations, the millennial generations, we are starting to see sort of them doing the types of brand switching that perhaps wouldn't necessarily have been expected, and so those are the ones that potentially are the shoppers of the future as well.
We'll get, we'll come very quickly on to some questions from our viewers, but I've got the luxury of asking one final one of my own. I'm going to come to you now, Michael. One of the things I'm most excited about are all these reports in the media about these wonderful feed additives we're hearing that are going to reduce all the methane from cattle. You're an animal nutrition expert, are they as good as they sound when I read about them in the daily papers? And how far away are they from farmers being able to buy them? Is there a catch?
Well, it's not a catch. There are some good products out there in the marketplace. Some have been very well researched. One in particular is going through the European Commission assessment through their panel called EFSA to be an approved feed additive for methane mitigation. So there is some really good science out there. I mean, obviously there are some products that may be a little bit ahead of the research that's behind them, but there are certainly a selection of good products out there that will sustainably or consistently, I would probably a better word, reduce the level of methane that is emitted from ruminants, providing the farmer administers the recommended dose to do that. So yeah, I'm very confident in those products, but that is not the only way to mitigate methane. To me, that is, shall we call it, the icing on the cake. There are other ways that farmers can reduce the methane produced by their animals whether that is producing higher quality forages with a high digestibility, which will reduce methane, maybe introducing more starchy based ingredients, whether they're starchy forages like whole crop, maize silage into their system. Even fats and oils at a token level can reduce the amount of methane. So it's about getting the base diet more suited to reduce the methane, and then adding the additive over the top to further drive down methane. Not let the additive do all the heavy lifting. It is a very holistic approach to doing it.
Well, can I? Sorry, I was just going to say, can I just come in there, Andrew, as well? So certainly, we sort of talked about this ourselves because we're investing in a research project with Queen's University Belfast at the minute, looking at seaweed, UK grown seaweed, as a potential methane inhibitor for cattle. So but similarly, as Michael sort of said, within all of our net zero, there's never going to be a silver bullet. It's all about how we can sort of think about lots of different sort of aspects of working with the right experts like Michael and others to try and help, as we sort of say, take all those different options. But I think some of those methane abatement products are hugely exciting and give a real sort of signal of hope really for the livestock industry, which in particular has sort of faced some barrage in recent years. And I think it's really brilliant to see those innovations coming through.
I suppose if I may just add to that, is that one of the challenges I think is going to be who pays for the additive. Now, on some of the products, and I think it's not right to start mentioning products per se, would suggest there is a small performance improvement. So whether that's extra lean meat yield, whether it's extra milk quality, milk yield, and maybe that will offset the cost of the additive. But I think it's fair to say farmers aren't going to use these additives just to be a good citizen, shall we say. There's got to be some means of driving their use to then allow that methane mitigation to come into force.
Let's take our first question and we'll just follow up on these issues. Michael, we've got a question here from Leighton Richard of Haysford Park, a farm. He's saying, is there any research showing which grasses or herbs or legumes might produce less methane in ruminants? Do we actually really have to wait for seaweed or something else? Is there an even more natural way to do the job?
I think we really have to just look at the chemistry of forages and how they're digested. Going back to the point I made a little earlier, is that it's about the digestibility of the fiber fraction. So if you're making a very leafy forage that is highly digestible, you're not going to get the sort of fermentation that leads to methane production. The more fibrous, the more hydrogen you produce in the system, the hydrogen has to go, and the ruminant the rumen bugs just convert it to methane. So less fiber, lower methane, irrespective of the forage type.
Okay. We'll go straight on to our next question then, and let's go to a different topic. Got a question here from Yorworth. I hope I pronounced that correctly. This was submitted ahead of our summit this evening, so I hope you're joining us tonight. He asks, with a fluctuating market, the whole transition process, etc., when would be a good time to actually make commitments in the carbon market? Should we wait until the soil carbon code has been signed off by government? Is there too much uncertainty completely out there to start trading yet? We touched on this a little bit in the first session, but which of our panel here tonight has got a view on that? Anyone?
I'll jump in, Andrew, just because I've been in this experience. So I have been through a woodland project actually myself, which means I am now the proud possessor of pre-issuance units against the Woodland Carbon Code. I have not sold them. I don't intend to do so, but I don't necessarily intend never to do so. So because it's exactly that point. I think it's not, if it's possible to enter the market but not necessarily trade in it, then I think that's a very sensible thing to start considering. I would also say baselining is the most important thing. This is going to become a data game as much as anything else, and that's going to lead across not just into carbon but any other form of ecosystem services payments, so biodiversity net gain, water quality, food provenance, and what may be demanded in the food chain. So data is actually the thing I would say is for me is the big project that's been for myself this year, and then also how I will enter these markets, because they are there, they are emerging, but not necessarily rushing to trade in them, because for the reason that the question is asked, it's uncertain. But it may become a very good point at which it's highly financially advantageous to do so.
And these are the same issues we're seeing with another potential income stream, is it not, with biodiversity net gain? And just for people who perhaps haven't realised this yet, the Environment Bill in England made a provision that house builders have to offset some of the impact of carpeting land in concrete and tarmac, etc., by either committing to improve biodiversity in the area around those houses, or on at a different location, which brings in the potential for farmers to be able to do it for them in some circumstances. But these are long-term commitments, aren't they, Tim? 30 or 40 years. Is there any farmer out there, do you think, who's brave enough to sign up to something like that? 30, 40 years ago was 1980, 1990. Look how much things have changed in that time. Where will we be down the road the same again?
Yeah. Things have definitely changed since that time. If I put that frame in mind, when I was wandering around in shorts, as it were, on the farm. But I think there will be some who are. I'm not sure brave is the right word. I think it's about it's a consideration of the natural capital and assets that you've currently got and what you could do with them. And that sounds like jargon, but if I say it's about what your soil is and what you can get from it, then that's not so much jargon. That's how we've all been thinking for many a decade and many a century, right? And that's, I think there's an evolution of thinking here rather than a revolution necessarily. And finally, certain things that farmers have been doing, stewardship of the countryside, of nature, and producing food, are all starting to get the appropriate recognition. A value is being attributed, and where there's value, there is financial gain to be made. So it's the challenges are going to be in the legal space. There are going to be long-term contracts, and there's going to be some complexity, what happens on sale of land and all these kinds of things, and they will have to be provided for. But I don't think those are insurmountable problems, and I don't think, again, if any sector is ready to think in these kind of generational timeframes, then I think it's farming, which is multi-generational to its core. So I think actually we're exactly the right place to be ready to do this.
We've got a question now from Victoria, just sort of leading on nicely from that. She asks, what is the likely scale of revenue generation for beef farmers on grass only, and over what time frame? I suppose the bigger question there is, which sector or which part of the country stands perhaps to gain the most, perhaps not now, but in the future, from selling carbon credits or biodiversity net gain, or some of these more embryonic things that are slowly emerging? Is it the upland farmer with who's currently doing the sheep, or is it the arable farmer down at the bottom of the valley? Who's got a view on that?
Well, perhaps one of the ways perhaps of looking at this is seeing where the starting point is. And indeed, this is all going to be an interesting part of the debate as the whole market matures, isn't it? Because arguably the one with the gain will possibly be the one that starts off from the lowest base level, and therefore has the highest opportunities to do that, which may well be possibly the intensive cereal farmer.
Okay, does anyone else want? Yep, go ahead, Sophie.
Yeah, I'll come in. So I think with this, it is within every farm's capability to have some sort of type of gain here. I think, we're farmers at home as well, we sort of look at our own farm, look at the farms that we're working really closely with on our projects. And, without doubt, every single farm has the opportunity to be able to lower emissions, and then think carefully about sort of like increasing that sequestration and creating that difference net carbon balance. So I think it's quite tricky to sort of say whether they're going to be winners and losers in this game, because potentially everybody everybody has the opportunity to be a winner, and if nobody does anything, also have the opportunity to be a loser. I think that's, it's sort of like, it's making sure that we're all getting on with something is really absolutely key here, because there is a lot of potential to make a really big difference and to take advantage, as we were sort of saying before, with wider civil society sort of having a real interest in farms, and hopefully farmers being able to take advantage of that and improve the climate and improve biodiversity. And that can be done, in the corner of fields or, up in the uplands. It can really be for everybody to access, I think.
Yeah, Andrew, I think that it's not just about payment for gain. I think there will be payments, both public and private, that will be made for maintenance. And there's existing embryonic schemes. The farming in protected landscapes is kind of in that sort of space to some degree, because it's sort of recognizing that there are, if you're in an AONB and you can't do something because that planning authority and will say absolutely not, don't plant those trees because that's not part of the landscape, let's say, then there are other pots of money, for lack of a better way of putting it, that are going to be put to saying, well, actually, but you do currently have something of value, and you can get paid to protect and then enhance that potentially. So it's going to emerge like that, I think.
Well, I will jump straight into a question from Claire there, and she's saying, is there likely to be any relaxation in AONB or conservation area rules to allow a greater flexibility in achieving net zero goals? Is it likely, or do we need it effectively, is the question, I suppose. Who's got a view on that? Tim, did you want to come back in there? You were started.
At the risk of upsetting people in the AONB, of which I sit just outside, but work with many just inside, I'm not seeing any particular desire to move from their part, because I think, as I just said, they kind of think there's a quid pro quo that they have this funding because it's about maintaining the character. But it is new funding and it is available, and they are giving it out. And I know people who have already got their hands on that money, so it is there. But of course, that's going to be an evolving piece as well, I'm quite sure. And it may be a very different picture in 5, 10, 20, 50 years time.
Okay, well, perhaps we'll move on slightly from making the most of what you've got and we'll think a bit more about new things to try again. Let's come back to you, William, and we'll take advantage of your miscanthus knowledge. I've got a question here from Ian. He's asking, how much carbon does a hectare of established miscanthus sequester annually? Is it one of the big sequestering crops?
Well, we've done our own LCAs on this through various European projects, and I mean, in a nutshell, miscanthus sequesters somewhere around 2.3 to 2.5 tons per hectare of CO2 per annum, and that's very much based though on soil type and crop yield. So high yielding crops going to have more underground activity and sequester more, but that will that is a guideline, and that will vary from farm to farm. And indeed, ultimately, the thing about the soil type is that all soils have ultimately a different carbon capacity. So it's a question that is maybe associated with the sort of land use change scenario, rather than necessarily saying that the crops are going to go on doing that ad infinitum.
The NFU's net zero strategy, I think, talks quite a lot about energy cropping and the use of more of that quick growing trees like miscanthus or quick growing crops, I should say. Without getting into too much of a pitch for your firm, shall we say, then do you think there's going to be a real uptick in interest in the next decade?
Well, the Committee on Climate Change's target for perennial biomass crops is about 700,000 hectares by 2050. So if we really started the upscaling before the end of this decade, that still means roughly 30,000 hectares per year of new planting, which is enormous. And I think there is a real opportunity here for it, because only those very, very fast-growing crops are going to produce any bioeconomic goods this side of 2050. So, traditionally we've looked in the UK at timber as a biomass resource, and we've got what we've got. But any new timber we put down, any new afforestation, isn't actually going to deliver any feedstocks or goods in that 2050 timescale. So that's really where the window for all of these is. Is that a really challenging target? Well, yes, I think it is. To put some context on that, I think when compulsory set-aside came in 1992, for those that can remember back that far, it got to about 660,000 hectares in 1994-5 at its peak. And it's roughly sort of twice the national oilseed rape crop. And I think there might be some nervousness about that those sorts of level of change, but they've been done before, and they can all be done within land that it is available and is not really prime food consumption. So I'm very confident that there are no particular conflicts about it. And the beauty of them is that by getting your biomass through crops rather than importing it, it is very controllable in every single way. And indeed, ultimately, should policy dictate, it is reversible.
And it is a carbon neutral crop then, even when you take into account sort of harvesting and tending it. Is that the case?
Yes, it is. It's carbon negative. So it is a net sequester. So that 2.3 to 2.5 tons of CO2 per hectare per year accounts for everything right the way up to the factory gate.
And you're not worried then, just to follow up on what you were saying before, you still see it as being grown mostly on land that's unsuitable for food. You don't think you're going to get dragged into this food versus fuel argument then?
Well, I think everybody chooses to have a very sort of bipolar attitude to this. So it's food versus fuel, food versus energy, energy versus fuel. The reality is we need a balanced system that really allows for everything, because quite simply, if we don't get the low carbon feedstocks, we've got a whole bioeconomy that's got to replace goods that currently rely on fossil derived alternatives. If we don't get those feedstocks, then we're going to be relying on the fossil based alternatives for longer. Those emissions are going to keep global warming up. That's going to damage our nature, wildlife, ecosystems, and ultimately that affects our ability to produce food as well. So it is a balance.
Okay, Michael, I'm going to come back to you for the next one. We've got a good question here from Teleri Fielden from the Farmers Union of Wales. She's asking, do carbon calculators take account of how much you're producing, e.g. a very productive system such as dairy may look negative? I guess she means bad there rather than carbon negative on emissions. However, they are producing a lot of milk. So I guess the bigger question is an intensive system better or is an extensive system better?
Well, that's a very good question. The first thing, all systems, it is possible to mitigate some of your GHGs. That's the first thing. Whether it's a low intensive or high intensive system is more efficient, well, we have to think about, decide what are the boundaries we are, so-called system boundaries that we're considering. And if we're talking about all the feed that's imported onto the farm, all the stock that comes off the farm, the manure management, the whole picture. And then we think about it really should be per litre of milk. because of the so-called functional unit, because it's not about per hectare, it's not about per cow, it's not about per farm, it's about the products that we produce and sell to the consumer. And so if you have a high input herd producing, say, 10,000 litres compared to a low input herd producing 5,000 litres, you could argue you need 2 low input cows to produce the same milk as 1 high input cow. And the problem is, if you've got 2 cows producing the same milk as 1 cow, you've got to put all the energy inputs into keeping one of those cows alive, which wasn't necessary. So the footprint per litre of milk from the 10,000 litre has the potential to be lower than that from the low. But it all then depends on what of your inputs and what's the footprint of those inputs into your low input versus your high. Now, one of the opportunities for livestock producers is to feed an increasing amount of co-products. Now, for those who know my company might expect me to say that. However, the methodology for calculating the footprint of feedstuffs favors co-products. This is international methodology. It's not UK methodology, international recognized methodology, United Nations, FAO, European Commission, whatever methodology. And co-products, whether they're dry, particularly moist ones, have a much lower footprint. So a high input system could have a lot of their inputs from co-products, which makes their footprint very, very competitive to a low input system, very reliant on grass, which again is a feedstock with a fairly low input. So there is not a straightforward answer, but it depends what your inputs and outputs are. But it'd be wrong to say that a low input system is better than a high and vice versa. But all have great possibility to reduce their footprint. And the other way to look at it is that of a litre of milk, roughly a third is due to feed inputs, the footprint, a third is due to enteric fermentation, and a third is the processing bit, for a footprint of a litre of milk on the supermarket shelf. The farmer can't affect the processing and the distribution, but they can affect what feed inputs go in and what enteric fermentation happens.
Sophie, that's a really good explanation of the trade-offs here, and I'm sure you've got you spend a lot of time thinking about that sort of thing too. I know the when farmers discuss this, often it comes down to soya, doesn't it? And so, would you rather have Morrison's been supplied by sort of efficient poultry, shall we say, with soya, or are you looking to maybe have a slower grown bird with no or fewer inputs from overseas? That's what it comes down to, isn't it? A lot of these debates.
So yeah, I think Michael, had a really great explanation. As obviously you would be doing, is fantastic in this field. I think the question of soya is really important. We have, as well as every other UK retailer, just about set a zero deforestation sort of benchmark for 2025, and obviously deforestation has been also very much part of the Environment Bill that's just come out too. And so we recognise that the reason that soya has its high environmental footprint is because of the risk of deforestation associated with it. So there are some countries of origin of soya which are therefore having a lower carbon footprint. So, for example, some of the work that we've done with sort of our partners is looking at sort of a lower footprint for US soya. However, that's not available all year round, and so it's understanding, just as Michael sort of said, what are all the different sort of inputs that are going into your flock, in which case we're going to talk about poultry. And so we are really interested in understanding, well, actually, what is the potential to still remain efficient? To take that other point is, and efficiency is a really important part of understanding we have a low carbon footprint, but also that can be coming from sort of feedstuffs that don't have that higher environmental footprint. So is it about, country of origin of soy? Is it about reduced or targeted use of soy? Is it about alternative proteins? And I think it depends on the species group that we're looking at as well. Recognise it's a much more challenging question in monogastrics, so in the pigs and poultry sector, than it is obviously in ruminants. Potentially we've got more possibility to take soya out of the diet in ruminant agriculture than we have in monogastric, and so it's also just being careful not to set a ban everything approach, but just to really sort of be quite sensitive about how we get there and with whom and with different species groups, but absolutely being alert to the facts that with that country of origin and that associated footprint is always going to be quite a big thing to get over.
Okay.
Completely agree with Sophie, if I may just add.
Please.
That yes, it is much more challenging to reduce the utilisation of soya in monogastric diets, particularly in the intensive broader production. But I think we have to look at what is the size of the opportunity. And if we look at dairy, for example, AIC about 18 months ago, and I was involved in this, did a estimate of how much soya is currently fed into dairy cows per annum, whether it's as a straight, the farmer buys a 28-ton load, or in a blend, or in a dairy compound. And we estimate circa 230,000 tonnes of soya still finds its way towards a dairy cow in some whatever shape or form. And today there are products out there in the marketplace that can replace that soya and produce the same milk yield, milk quality. Generally, it's at less cost, but perhaps sometimes maybe at an incrementally slightly higher cost. So it is the art of the possible. It depends who's driving it. And even on pigs and poultry, even in broilers, quite a few years ago, there's a major piece of work that DEFRA co-funded, looking at feeding bioethanol wheat distillers to displace a small portion of soya from broiler rations. Again, slightly high raw material cost. It's who's going to pay for it, but it is the art of the possible. It's will the market be driven that way?
Thank you. We've got another question here, quite a specific one, so we'll see if anyone's got a view on it. But thank you, Lewis Peretta, for submitting this question. Are the panel aware of many farmers looking to receive funding from Biomass Feedstock Innovation Programme? Does the panel have any expectations of the new biomass strategy expected to be published next year? And what impact will this have on UK farming? William, does Miscanthus come under that, or is this something different?
The biomass strategy certainly Miscanthus comes under. We all await that report anxiously, because I think it's going to be, whilst we have a situation where we've got bays churning out things like the BFIP and all sorts of other biomass research money, and that is something that's well worth looking at. But I think the real crunch is then getting DEFRA, who are responsible for what really goes on the land, to take up this the chalice and run with it, and to do so actually before they unveil everything else first, because we don't want to find ourselves in a position where we're all being tempted to do 101 other things, and then as soon as we've done it, they turn around and say, yeah, we've all these biomass projects have shown really promising things. We now like biomass too, because it'll have missed the boat. And that's the concern. But I think that the BFIP is for on-farm innovation around biomass, and I think it is possibly attractive for people who are interested.
Okay. Tim, of course, the reason that a number of farmers are interested in this now is the withdrawal of the BPS, and they're looking to find alternative funding streams to fill that subsidy gap. We've got a question here from Richard Gardner, who asks, there's a school of thought that says removing all financial support would be effective in driving real change towards a more sustainable future. Do you think on your farm, you're feeling incentivized in this direction because of BPS in particular? Or BPS withdrawal?
Yeah, well, I'd say if obviously it could be effective depending on what you mean by effective. I saw it would create change, but if it caused, if the rug being pulled out, as it were, and there was collapse of farm businesses across the country as a result. I don't think that's the kind of change that anyone wants, because think of the knowledge loss, let alone the financial ruin on the individual basis. So I think but clearly there is a direction of travel, a tapering off, and I think that should make everyone sit up and think, if they haven't already, about the ongoing financial resilience of their farming enterprise, whatever that may be. And of course, that's I've talked a little bit just earlier about I think the data being the watchword, and I think in this topic, carbon baselining being an important exercise for people to go through. But if people haven't been through the financial baselining and understanding their financial position and what it looks like post BPS, then that's also a very good thing to be doing in the early years of the taper, as that taper becomes more severe in the later years. As we've talked about, there are, going back to what William was just saying, there's going to be all kinds of things the government are throwing out, from different departments, things left, right, and centre, small pots here, large pots there, some of which may be applicable to some enterprises on farm and not others. It's about looking for the opportunity, but you only really know if you're in a good place to take up an opportunity if you've taken the time to look at your current financial and also, as we've been talking about, carbon nature position.
Sophie, these are huge changes, aren't they? In particular for livestock farmers, you must be concerned about your supply chain, or if you ended up, dealing with half the farmers you do currently, perhaps actually the supply of food isn't going to alter. What's your view on that?
So, we are supplied by a lot of family farms at Morrison's, and, it's brilliant. We're really proud to be so. And many of those farms have supplied us for generations. So, we are very minded to make sure we have a resilient farm supply chain in the future as well. So that's sort of why we, I suppose, been doing quite a lot in this space and the net zero space, and setting what are challenging targets of 2030, but just putting lots of money behind, because we're trying to, and investment and support, because we're trying to understand, well, how can we sort of help our farming supply base become resilient and still be there in the future, so we can still continue trading with those farmers who we've known so well. So and we know as well that increasingly, as shoppers have always been fond of farmers and, sort of held them very dear to their heart. But certainly, since COVID times, I think the role of the farmer and the position of the farmer and as a food provider has become even more dear to consumers. And we've certainly sort of seen that, customers are wanting to have that connection, wanting to have that transparency. And so thinking that we're helping to preserve those farmers who are in the communities in which our colleagues and customers live and work is really, really important. So, I think it's about making sure we have a very vibrant, resilient British farming industry for the future. And that's why I think doing things like transition and other elements of work as well is really important to give all of those farmers the opportunity to succeed in the future if they want to.
Yeah, please come in, William. You're just on mute.
Okay. I would just chip in. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the milk quotas coming in, and we've also seen the effects of set aside being introduced, and from my own experience with miscanthus and everything else. I think the fact that there are alternative land use or alternative ways of doing things emerging, I don't think necessarily threatens food production or the opportunities at all. I think they're in a way quite exciting. I think in terms of food supply, I don't think 15% set aside made a huge difference to overall food supply, simply because people chose to set aside the land they didn't really want to farm anyway. Similarly, my own experience with putting miscanthus on my farm at home was actually that all of the easier win land just did better and produced more. So it's not. I don't think we need to see all of these things as a threat. And the lesson from the milk quota thing was actually it forced people to look again at the way they ran their enterprises. But actually after that, in spite of the fact everybody was saying, well, that'll be the end of the dairy industry, actually the dairy industry has flourished since. So So I think, I think people should view this positively, and if the outcome is that we get things that are better and possibly of better quality and everything out of it, that's going to be good.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, but I've just got time for one more. I just want to ask Tim, with your banking hat on, perhaps one thing we haven't touched on this evening is, what is going to be the upshot for land prices as all of these things work through, particularly the withdrawal of subsidy, because sometimes the opportunity for some folk is simply going to be retirement if they don't want to grapple with all of this, isn't it? And so how are they going to fare?
I think the jury is obviously still out on where that's going to go. I'm not going to say exactly where I think land prices go, but actually there's been some interesting research recently by the major land agents and rural estate agents that's actually saying although supply of land is short into the market, there's a lot of competition for that land from those who are interested in the carbon and nature opportunities. Now that could be seen as a concern if that's crowding out farmers from being able to get into taking that land on for food production, obviously. But we generally say that the support for land prices is there, because the policy context is evolving. I mean, it's back to Mark Twain. They don't make any more of land, so if you, it's going to hold an inherent value, because it's I'll go back. It's the soil. It's the natural capital. It's what can we do with it? And to pick up from William was just saying, and the previous question, this is agriculture in the UK, which is adaptable and incredibly entrepreneurial across everything that's possible. So transition is opportunity, and the chance to take what you've got and really make the most of it. And I think that's a characteristic that we know is across UK farming. And it just needs the policy context, the food supply chain, and the private sector, finance as well, to support it.
Thank you very much. Well, look, we are just about out of time here now, and we've had a real whistle-stop tour. Last 2 hours have absolutely flown by, but I think, as Tim said there, transition is opportunity. There's opportunity perhaps with government schemes. As we talked in the first and second panel, there's opportunity to still hone your own business, particularly in some circumstances, to make more money. There's opportunities to hook up with retailers and help them meet consumer expectations by showing your green credentials. And maybe in the future, perhaps the highest risk of all, there is opportunity with offsetting, but a lot of caution about going too big too soon on that one. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to our second panel, Sophie, William, Michael and Tim. You've been terrific. Thank you for your time. Before I say my final words, let's watch our final videos from this evening, a presentation from our transition partners. We're going to hear first from Morrison's, and then we're going to have a video from Harper Adams University.
Our planet's pretty good, isn't it? And at Morrison's, we want to help keep it that way. It's why we've promised to be the very first supermarket to be 100% supplied by net zero British farms by 2030. And because we're British farming's single biggest direct customer, we're uniquely placed to make this happen. Working with 3,000 farmers we know and trust.
The aim is to become carbon zero on this farm by 2030. They're putting me in contact with experts who can suggest different systems to us and different ways of doing things to reduce our carbon output. We're also trying to farm in balance with nature in a sustainable way as we possibly can.
To produce affordable, net zero British fruit, veg and fresh meat. And to help us get there, we've teamed up with the NFU, McDonald's and Harper Adams University to set up the world's first school of sustainable food and farming. That'll help both our farmers today, as well as our farmers of the future, work sustainably and help make good things happen for all of us.
So the School of Sustainable Food and Farming is a virtual centre, so there's no bricks and mortar. It's a way that we can pull together all the academics at Harper to address this great big challenge that's coming about sustainability and about net zero carbon emissions.
We have to find a way to balance all those things across the planet. And it's our job, and it's now. You know, the climate COP26, all those things are happening now for a reason, because we've reached a point where we don't really have an alternative. And so the best and proactive way to talk about that is to go, okay, starting with the fundamentals, how can we change everything we do? And that's kind of why Morrison's and Harper have got so close on this, is because we kind of want the same things. We want to create this legacy. That's what the School of Sustainable Food and Farming is about, is creating a legacy of blueprints of how to do this stuff for the future.
Morrison's. Make good things happen.
Wonderful stuff. Thank you to Morrison's and Harper Adams for that. If you know someone that wasn't able to join us this evening that would find this interesting, then please do remind them that this will all be available to watch on Catch Up. Just go to fwi.co.uk and find our transition section, or check our YouTube channel in the days ahead. And don't forget, this is just the second of our 5 summits, with the next one taking place at 5 p.m. on Thursday, the 27th of January, when we'll be talking about the challenge of improving productivity in more detail. I'd like to thank our technical team, which helped everything run smoothly this evening, and all of our transition partners for making this series possible. You can find out more of them again on our website at fwi.co.uk/transition. If you have a minute, then please answer our feedback questionnaire, which should be in the resources window at the bottom of your screen. We appreciate this is a learning curve for us too, and we'd love to know how we can do the best job possible. Finally, a huge thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. As our next summit is in January, can I be the first person to wish you all a very Merry Christmas if it's not too early? See you at the next summit. Good night, everyone.